You people don't belong in places like this." The restaurant manager's voice cut through the elegant evening atmosphere like a blade. Her manicured finger pointed directly at Simone Carter's face, while dozens of customers froze mid-conversation. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor as the black waitress clutched her simple emerald ring, the only inheritance from her late father. Humiliation burning through her chest like fire. Wine glasses suspended in shocked silence as the distinguished guests witnessed the public destruction of a woman's dignity. What none of them knew was that a powerful man sat watching from a corner table, his face draining of all color, as his eyes locked onto that emerald ring. Little did Simone know that this moment of devastating humiliation would soon transform into the most extraordinary twist of fate she never saw coming. The evening rush at Le Jardin had reached its crescendo when everything began to unravel. Simone Carter moved between tables with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp, despite the demanding shift that had stretched past 10 hours. The upscale Atlanta restaurant hummed with conversations of well-dressed patrons, gentle clinks of crystal glasses, and soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers. After 3 years working here, Simone knew every corner which customers preferred bitter without ice, exactly how long it took to walk from kitchen to furthest booth without appearing rushed. Tonight felt different. Perhaps it was tomorrow's rent notice folded in her purse, or knowing her 10-year-old daughter Chloe needed new school shoes before Monday. Maybe it was her mother's prescription running low again pills that kept arthritis pain manageable, but cost more than Simone earned in 2 days of tips. She touched the emerald ring on her finger, a nervous habit, since childhood, feeling the familiar comfort of smooth stone against skin. It was all she had left of her father Dennis, who died when she was 19, leaving behind memories of his gentle laugh and this simple jewelry that made her feel less alone. The trouble started at table 14, where a middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit nursed his third scotch while complaining about everything from steak temperature to background music volume. Simone had apologized twice, offered a new meal, suggested a quieter table. Nothing satisfied him. When she returned with his corrected order, medium rare, instead of medium extra sauce on the side, he barely glanced before launching into another tirade. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, voice carrying to nearby tables. "Service here has gone completely downhill. I don't know what kind of people you're hiring, but they clearly don't understand serving customers who actually matter." His eyes swept over Simone, with unconcealed disdain lingering on her natural hair, pulled back her dark skin, the way she stood with quiet dignity, despite his verbal assault. Some people just don't belong in establishments like this. Heat rose in Simone's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding. Is there anything specific I can do to improve your experience?" The words came automatically drilled through countless training sessions about customer service and de-escalation. She had learned that responding with anything other than perfect politeness would only make things worse, especially with customers determined to find fault with her existence. The businessman's companion, a blonde woman with perfectly styled hair, placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Maybe we should just finish and go," she murmured, uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. But her suggestion only fueled his anger. He shook off her touch and leaned forward, voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "Don't tell me how to handle this," he snapped before turning back to Simone. "And you, I want your manager, right now. I'm not going to pretend this level of attitude is acceptable." The way he said attitude made clear he meant something else entirely, something having nothing to do with Simone's actual behavior and everything to do with his own prejudices. Across the dining room, Edward Pemberton sat at his usual corner table, one offering privacy while allowing him to observe restaurant operations. He had been coming to Le Jardin for business dinners for 5 years, appreciating its reputation for excellent food and discreet service. Tonight, however, his attention focused completely on the unfolding drama. He watched the young waitress handle the difficult customer with remarkable composure, noting how she maintained professional demeanor despite obvious provocation. Something about her dignity reminded him of someone else, someone from long ago, who had shown similar grace under pressure. When Simone returned with manager Olivia Hartwell, Pemberton found himself leaning forward, business documents forgotten. He had met Hartwell briefly during previous visits, a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s who ran the restaurant with iron fist, an obsession with maintaining what she called standards. She approached table 14 with confident stride of someone accustomed to wielding authority, blonde hair, pulled back in severe chignon, matching her perpetually stern expression. "Good evening, Mr. Davidson," Hartwell said, tone immediately deferential, in a way that made Pemberton's stomach tighten. "I understand there's been concern about your service tonight. We take such matters very seriously here at Le Jardin." She didn't glance at Simone, who stood silently beside her, hands clasped in front of uniform. The dismissal was complete and deliberate, as if the waitress were furniture that had somehow offended a valued customer. Davidson straightened clearly, pleased to have authority acknowledge his importance. Finally, "Yes, there's definitely been a problem. This waitress has been completely inappropriate all evening. Argumentative, disrespectful. Frankly, I'm surprised you allow this behavior from staff. My colleagues and I come here regularly, and we expect a certain level of professionalism." Again, that loaded pause, careful word choice, conveying exactly what he meant without saying it directly. Pemberton watched Hartwell's expression harden, though not in defense of her employee. Instead, she turned to face Simone, with cold fury, suggesting this was not isolated. "Is this true?" she demanded, voice loud enough to carry across the now silent dining room. Every conversation had stopped. Every face turned toward the confrontation. "Have you been arguing with Mr. Davidson because I've told you before about maintaining appropriate boundaries with our clientele?" "Ma'am, I haven't argued with anyone," Simone replied quietly, voice steady despite tremor. Pemberton could see in her hands. "I've simply tried to address Mr. Davidson's concerns about his meal and—" "Don't make excuses," Hartwell cut her off sharply. "Mr. Davidson is a valued customer, and if he says there's been a problem, then there's been a problem. This is exactly the attitude I've been concerned about." She stepped closer to Simone, voice rising with each word. "You seem to think you can argue with our guests, decide what level of service they deserve. But let me be very clear, you work for me, and you serve who I tell you to serve, how I tell you to serve them." The dining room fell into complete silence, only soft jazz still playing overhead, and gentle air conditioning hum remaining. Pemberton felt his chest tighten as he watched the scene unfold, recognizing something in how Simone held herself, despite verbal assault, Wyatt. Strength refusing to break even, facing such public humiliation. When she unconsciously touched the ring on her finger gesture, so small and vulnerable, it seemed almost like a prayer. He found himself studying the jewelry more closely. It was simple, elegant in understated design, small emerald set in what looked like white gold. Nothing flashy or expensive, but something about it made Pemberton's breath catch, sent shock of recognition through his entire body. The setting, how the stone caught light, delicate engravings around the band, barely visible from his distance, but somehow achingly familiar. His mind raced back 20 years, to dark highway and burning car, to a man who had refused money, but accepted a token of friendship instead. "You know what?" Hartwell's voice rose to near shout. "I've had enough of this. You clearly don't understand what it means to work in an establishment like Le Jardin. You don't belong here serving our distinguished guests." Her finger pointed directly at Simone's face gesture, both accusing and dismissive. "Clean out your locker. You're fired. Effective immediately." The words hung like a physical blow, and Pemberton watched blood drain from Simone's face. She stood perfectly still for a moment, stretching into eternity. dark eyes wide with shock, and something deeper recognition that this moment would change everything. That fragile stability she had built for herself and family was crumbling in front of dozens of strangers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above whisper. "Yes, ma'am." Pemberton's hands clenched into fists as he watched Simone turn and walk toward the restaurant's back, spine straight, despite obvious effort it cost her. The emerald ring caught light one final time as she moved through the dining room, and in that moment, Edward Pemberton knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at the daughter of the man who had saved his life 20 years ago. Edward Pemberton's hands trembled as he stared at the empty space where Simone Carter had stood moments before. The emerald ring, he would recognize it anywhere, even after 20 years. The memory crashed over him like a tidal wave, transporting him back to that fateful night when his life had hung by a thread, and a stranger's kindness had changed everything. It was October of 2004, and Edward had been driving back from a disastrous business meeting in rural Georgia. At 38, he was still clawing his way up the corporate ladder, desperate to prove himself worthy of the family name and the expectations that came with it. The meeting had gone poorly. A potential investor had pulled out at the last minute, leaving Edward's startup technology company on the brink of bankruptcy. He had been driving too fast on the dark country highway, his mind consumed with calculations of debt and desperation when the deer appeared in his headlights. The collision sent his sedan spinning off the asphalt and down a steep embankment, where it rolled twice before slamming into a massive oak tree. Edward remembered the taste of blood in his mouth, the acrid smell of gasoline filling his nostrils, and the terrible realization that he was trapped upside down in a vehicle that could explode at any moment. His left leg was pinned beneath twisted metal, his vision blurred from a head wound that sent warm blood trickling down his face. In those moments of terror, he had genuinely believed he was going to die alone on a forgotten stretch of Georgia back road. That was when Dennis Carter had appeared like an angel in work clothes. The black mechanic had been driving home from his late shift at the auto repair shop when he spotted the wreckage. Without hesitation, he had pulled over and scrambled down the embankment, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he assessed the situation. Edward could still remember Dennis's calm, steady voice cutting through his panic. "Stay still, son. I'm going to get you out of there, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." Dennis had worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood machinery and understood danger. He had used a tire iron from his own truck to pry open the passenger door, then carefully maneuvered Edward out of the wreckage just minutes before the engine finally caught fire. The entire rescue couldn't have taken more than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes had been the difference between life and death. As they sat on the hillside watching Edward's car burn, waiting for the ambulance Dennis had called on his cell phone, Edward had tried desperately to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "You saved my life," he had said, his voice hoarse from smoke and emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. Please let me do something for you. Money, anything, name it." But Dennis had just shaken his head. With that gentle smile, Edward would never forget his dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the burning vehicle below them. "Money's not what matters, son," Dennis had replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to find value in things that couldn't be bought or sold. "Just promise me you'll remember this night, and when you see someone who needs help, you'll be the one to stop. That's all the thanks I need." But Edward had insisted, pulling off the emerald ring that had been in his family for 3 generations, a simple piece inherited from his grandmother, who had worn it every day until her death. "Then take this," Edward had said, pressing the ring into Dennis's calloused palm, not as payment, but as a promise, a reminder that kindness exists in this world, and that tonight you were an angel to a stranger. Dennis had tried to refuse, but Edward had been adamant. "Please, it would mean everything to me if you accepted it. Someday, when I've made something of myself, I want to find you again, And thank you properly." Dennis had finally accepted the ring, slipping it into his work shirt pocket with careful reverence. They had exchanged contact information while waiting for the paramedics. But in the chaos of Edward's hospital stay and subsequent recovery, something had gone wrong. The phone number Dennis had given him was disconnected. The address led to an empty lot, where a house had apparently been demolished for a development project. Every lead Edward followed seemed to dead end, as if Dennis Carter had simply vanished into thin air. For 20 years, Edward had carried the weight of that unpaid debt. As his technology company had grown into a billion-dollar empire, as he had accumulated wealth beyond his wildest dreams, the knowledge that he had never properly thanked the man who saved his life had gnawed at him like a constant ache. He had hired private investigators, placed ads in newspapers across Georgia, even started a foundation dedicated to helping mechanics and auto workers, hoping somehow the good work would reach Dennis or someone who knew him. Now sitting in Le Jardin restaurant, with the taste of expensive wine turning bitter in his mouth, Edward finally understood why his searches had failed. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and dialed the number of Marcus Webb, the private investigator, who had been his most recent attempt to solve the 20-year-old mystery. The call connected on the second ring. "Marcus, it's Edward Pemberton," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I need you to drop everything and focus on a new lead. The name is Simone Carter, age 34, worked as a waitress at Le Jardin restaurant in Atlanta. I need to know everything about her, but especially about her family. Her father, specifically." Within 6 hours, Marcus had called back with a file that made Edward's heart sink into his stomach. Dennis Carter had died 11 years ago at the age of 53, succumbed to lung cancer after a 2-year battle he had fought largely alone. He had been working 2 jobs to support his teenage daughter and ailing mother, but the medical bills had consumed everything. The insurance from his primary job at the auto shop had covered only a fraction of the treatment costs, and Dennis had refused to go into debt that would burden his family after his death. "He died in a public hospital," Marcus reported, his professional tone unable to mask the tragedy of the story. "The records show he declined several recommended treatments because of cost. His daughter Simone was 23 at the time, working 2 part-time jobs while attending community college. She dropped out to take care of her grandmother and never went back to school." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 11 years of missed opportunities settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. If he had found Dennis in time, money would have been no object. The best doctors, the most advanced treatments. Whatever it took, Edward would have moved heaven and earth to save the man who had saved him. But now it was too late for the father, which meant everything depended on what he could do for the daughter. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. Dennis Carter's daughter was working as a waitress in a restaurant, where Edward regularly dined serving customers, who treated her with casual disrespect, scraping by on tips and wages that probably barely covered her basic expenses. She was struggling in exactly the kind of situation her father might have escaped if Edward had found him in time to return the favor that had been owed for 2 decades. As Edward sat in his penthouse apartment later that night, staring out at the Atlanta skyline, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't bring Dennis Carter back, couldn't undo the years of hardship that pride and circumstances had forced the man to endure alone. But Dennis's daughter was still alive, still fighting the same battles her father had fought. And Edward finally had a chance to honor the debt that had shaped his entire adult life. The emerald ring had found its way back to him through fate, or providence, or simple coincidence. It no longer mattered which. What mattered was that Edward Pemberton finally had the opportunity to prove worthy of the second chance Dennis Carter had given him on that dark highway 20 years ago. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate process of approaching Simone Carter, and somehow, without revealing too much too quickly, finding a way to change her life the way her father had changed his. 3 weeks after losing her job at Le Jardin, Simone Carter stood in the cereal aisle of the discount grocery store calculator app, open on her cracked phone screen, adding and subtracting numbers that never seemed to work in her favor. $43.16. That was what remained in her checking account after paying the electric bill. The rent was due in 5 days. Chloe needed lunch money for school, and her mother's arthritis medication would run out by Thursday. Each item she placed in her cart required careful consideration, a mental calculation of necessity versus luxury that had become the defining feature of her daily existence. The job search had been a nightmare of closed doors and polite rejections. Word traveled fast in Atlanta's restaurant industry, and somehow every potential employer seemed to know about her attitude problem at Le Jardin. The story had been twisted in the telling, transformed from unjust firing to justified termination of a difficult employee. She had applied to diners, chain restaurants, coffee shops, even fast food establishments, desperate enough to hire anyone with food service experience. The interviews always started promisingly. Her 3 years at Le Jardin looked impressive on paper, but they invariably ended with the same apologetic explanation about needing to check references. Simone picked up a box of generic breakfast cereal, comparing the unit price to the name brand version that Chloe preferred. The difference was only 73 cents. But 73 cents might mean the difference between having enough gas money to drive to job interviews or walking everywhere for the rest of the week. She put the generic version in her cart and moved toward the produce section, where she carefully selected the least expensive items that would still provide some nutritional value for her family. It was while she was examining a bag of discount apples, checking each one for soft spots and bruises, that Edward Pemberton appeared at her side like a well-dressed apparition. She didn't recognize him at first, without the upscale restaurant setting and formal business attire. He looked different. Today he wore khakis and a simple button-down shirt, the kind of casual elegance that suggested money without flaunting it. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His skin had the healthy glow of someone who could afford regular exercise and premium health care, and his hands showed no signs of the manual labor that had marked her father's fingers for as long as she could remember. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just enough uncertainty to seem genuine. "I'm sorry to bother you, but weren't you working at Le Jardin restaurant a few weeks ago? I think you served my table once or twice." Simone looked up from the apples, her guard immediately raised. In her experience, former customers who approached her outside of work rarely had good intentions, especially if they were wealthy white men who had witnessed her public humiliation. "Yes, sir, I used to work there," she replied carefully, setting down the bag of apples and unconsciously touching her father's ring. "Is there something I can help you with?" She studied his face, trying to remember if he had been one of the customers who had watched her firing with sympathetic silence or cruel satisfaction. There had been so many faces that night, all of them blurring together in her memory of shame and shock. Edward seemed to sense her wariness and took a small step back, his hands visible and non-threatening. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be interested in a job opportunity. I know this might sound strange meeting like this, but I own a consulting firm here in Atlanta, and we're looking for someone to coordinate our corporate events and client meetings. The position requires someone with hospitality experience, someone who understands how to make people feel welcome and comfortable." Simone's heart leaped, but she forced herself to remain cautious. Job offers from strangers in grocery stores were the stuff of scams and fairy tales, not real life. "What kind of consulting firm?" she asked, shifting her weight slightly so she could move toward the exit if necessary. She had learned to trust her instincts about people, and while this man didn't set off any immediate alarm bells, the situation was too convenient to be entirely believable. "Technology consulting primarily for nonprofit organizations," Edward replied smoothly. "We help charities and foundations implement digital systems to better serve their communities. It's rewarding work, though I'll admit it can be demanding. The event's coordinator position would involve managing our client appreciation dinners, coordinating conference logistics, that sort of thing. The salary would be $60,000 annually plus benefits. $60,000. Simone felt her knees go weak at the number. It was more than double what she had been making at Le Jardin, more money than she had ever imagined earning in her entire life. It would mean security for Chloe, proper medical care for her mother, maybe even the possibility of going back to school herself someday. But it was also too good to be true, which meant there had to be a catch. "Why me?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know anything about my qualifications, my education, my background. For all you know, I could be completely incompetent at event planning." She watched his face, carefully looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Men didn't approach struggling single mothers in grocery stores with life-changing job offers unless they wanted something in return, something that probably wasn't mentioned in any official job description. Edward nodded, as if he had expected the question, and appreciated her directness. "Fair point. The truth is, I've been observing the service industry for a while now, looking for someone with the right combination of professionalism and grace under pressure. I saw how you handled yourself at Le Jardin, even in difficult circumstances. That kind of composure and dignity is exactly what we need for this position." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, offering it to her with steady hands. "Look, I understand this seems unusual. Why don't you take my card? Think about it for a day or two, and if you're interested, give me a call. We can set up a proper interview, discuss the details, let you ask all the questions you need to ask." The card was elegant but simple cream-colored paper with raised lettering that read, "Edward Pemberton, President, Pemberton Strategic Solutions." Simone took the card, noting the downtown Atlanta address and the weight of the paper stock that suggested real money behind the business. "What makes you think I'm even looking for a job?" she asked, though they both knew the answer was obvious from her careful grocery shopping and worn clothing. "Maybe I'm perfectly happy with my current situation." "Maybe you are," Edward agreed with a slight smile that seemed genuinely kind rather than patronizing. "But if you're looking for an opportunity to use your skills in a more supportive environment, then I hope you'll consider giving us a chance. We believe in treating our employees with respect and dignity, regardless of their background or previous experience." After Edward left, Simone stood in the grocery store for a long time, staring at the business card in her hand and trying to process what had just happened. The logical part of her mind insisted this was some kind of elaborate scam or inappropriate proposition disguised as legitimate employment. Men like Edward Pemberton didn't rescue struggling waitresses from financial ruin out of the goodness of their hearts. There had to be an angle, a hidden agenda that would reveal itself once she was sufficiently desperate or grateful to ignore the warning signs. But another part of her, the part that had inherited her father's faith in human decency, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what it appeared to be, a second chance offered by someone who had witnessed injustice and chosen to act. As she finished her shopping and drove home to the small apartment she shared with her mother and daughter Simone, found herself thinking about the emerald ring on her finger and the stories her father used to tell about unexpected kindness from strangers. Perhaps the universe had finally decided to balance the scales in her favor. Or perhaps she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. 2 weeks into her new position at Pemberton Strategic Solutions, Simone Carter felt like she was living in someone else's life. The downtown Atlanta office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower. Her desk sat in a spacious coordinator's office with advanced computer systems. The work was engaging, coordinating charity galas, managing donor appreciation events, ensuring technology implementations went smoothly for organizations serving homeless shelters, food banks, and community health centers. But something wasn't right. Edward Pemberton was too attentive, too interested in her well-being for someone who supposedly barely knew her. He remembered details about her life she was certain she had never shared: Chloe's upcoming school project, her mother's physical therapy schedule, even her coffee preference. When she mentioned needing to leave early for a parent-teacher conference, he not only granted permission immediately, but suggested she take the entire afternoon off with full pay. The breaking point came on Thursday morning when Simone arrived to find a gift basket on her desk filled with gourmet groceries and a note reading, "For your mother's birthday tomorrow, Edward." She stared at the basket for 5 minutes, trying to remember when she might have mentioned her mother's birthday. She was absolutely certain the topic had never come up, which meant Edward Pemberton was having her investigated or had access to information no legitimate employer should possess. Simone stormed into Edward's corner office without knocking, the gift basket clutched in her trembling hands. He looked up from his computer with genuine surprise, clearly not expecting the confrontation about to unfold. "Who are you really?" she demanded, setting the basket down with enough force to rattle his crystal paperweight. "And don't give me some corporate nonsense about being observant. Nobody knows their employee's mother's birthday unless they're running background checks or having them followed." Edward's face went through surprise, resignation, and finally something that looked like relief. He closed his laptop and gestured toward the chairs facing his desk. "You're right to be suspicious," he said quietly, "and you deserve the truth. All of it. Please sit down. This is going to take a while to explain properly." Simone remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "Start talking. And if you lie to me or try to feed me some prepared story, I'm walking out of here and never coming back." She meant it, despite the fact that losing this job would mean returning to financial desperation. Her dignity was worth more than any salary, a lesson her father had taught, through example. Edward nodded slowly, hands folded on the desk. 20 years ago, I was in a car accident on a country highway outside Atlanta. My car rolled down an embankment and caught fire, and I was trapped inside, certain I was going to die. A man named Dennis Carter stopped to help me. He risked his own life to pull me out of that burning vehicle, and when I tried to repay him with money, he refused. So I gave him something else instead, a family ring that had belonged to my grandmother. Simone's hand moved instinctively to her father's emerald ring, and she saw Edward's eyes follow the movement. The color drained from her face as the implications began to sink in. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. The timing was right. Her father had told her stories about helping strangers on the road, though he had never mentioned specific details. "An emerald set in white gold," Edward continued gently, "with tiny engravings around the band that read, 'Forever faithful, forever true.' It was my grandmother's wedding ring, and giving it to your father seemed like the only adequate way to express my gratitude for saving my life." He paused, studying her face with eyes that held 20 years of regret. "I tried to find him for years afterward to thank him properly and make sure he was okay, but somehow the contact information got lost, and every lead I followed turned into a dead end." Simone sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She pulled off the emerald ring and held it up to the light, reading the inscription she had memorized in childhood but never understood. "Forever faithful, forever true," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Daddy used to say those words to me when I was scared or upset. He said they were a reminder that good things come to people who stay true to themselves. He saved my life," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion, "and by the time I found out what had happened to him, it was too late. Dennis died 11 years ago from lung cancer, alone in a public hospital, because he couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved him." The words hit Simone like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears about how her father had suffered in his final years. "You knew," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "When you saw me at Le Jardin, when you approached me in the grocery store, you knew exactly who I was." The betrayal felt worse than any insult or humiliation she had endured from difficult customers. At least their contempt had been honest. This felt like manipulation disguised as kindness. Charity offered to ease a guilty conscience rather than genuine concern. Edward leaned forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I knew, but not because I was trying to deceive you. I recognized the ring immediately. I had been searching for that ring, and the man who wore it for 20 years. When I realized you were Dennis's daughter, I felt like the universe was giving me one last chance to honor the debt I owed your father. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. I couldn't save Dennis, but maybe I could help you. Maybe I could finally find a way to repay the kindness that literally gave me my life back. Simone wiped her eyes, her mind struggling to process the revelation that her father had touched this man's life in such a profound way. Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning? Why the elaborate charade with the job offer and the coincidental meeting? The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, the pain of someone who had been lied to by yet another person she had started to trust. Because I was afraid, Edward admitted. Afraid you would think I was trying to buy your forgiveness, or that my help came with strings attached. I wanted you to succeed on your own merits, to prove to yourself that you deserved every opportunity I could provide. Your father was the most dignified man I've ever met, and I could see that same dignity in you. I didn't want to diminish that by making you feel like charity case. The office fell silent, except for distant traffic sounds. Simone stared at the emerald ring in her palm, thinking about her father's stories about random acts of kindness and the ripple effects of treating strangers with compassion. She thought about the values he had instilled in her, the belief that people were fundamentally good, that kindness mattered more than money, and that everyone deserved dignity, regardless of circumstances. What happens now? She asked, finally, looking up to meet Edward's anxious gaze. Do you expect me to be grateful? To pretend that everything is fine because you meant well? The questions weren't accusations. They were genuine attempts to understand how their relationship could move forward now that the truth was finally open. Edward shook his head slowly. I don't expect anything from you, Simone. You have every right to be angry with me for not being honest from the start. If you want to leave, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand completely. But if you're willing to give me a chance to earn your trust, I'd like to propose something that might help both of us heal from the past 20 years. The revelation Edward proposed over lunch made Simone's blood run cold. They sat in a corner booth at a family restaurant where conversations could remain private. Edward had insisted they meet away from the office, claiming he needed to share information that could put both of them at risk. Simone had agreed reluctantly, still processing the emotional upheaval of learning about her father's connection to this man. Olivia Hartwell isn't just a cruel restaurant manager. Edward began, his voice low and urgent. She's the niece of Harold Manning, my former business partner, who destroyed our relationship 20 years ago. He showed Simone a photograph of a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and cold eyes that reminded her of Olivia's perpetual sneer. Manning was my original investor when I started the technology company. We were supposed to be equal partners, but he had different ideas about success. Simone studied the photograph, noting the family resemblance between Manning and the woman who had humiliated her. What kind of different ideas, she asked, though she suspected the answer would involve the casual cruelty that seemed to run in their family. Edward's jaw tightened. Harold believed that success gave us the right to look down on people he considered beneath us. When I started talking about using profits for charitable work, for giving back to communities that had supported us, he became increasingly hostile. He saw my gratitude toward your father as weakness, dangerous sentimentality that would interfere with our ability to maximize profits. The words came out bitter and angry, 20 years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. But the real betrayal came when I started actively searching for Dennis. Edward continued, his hands clenched into fists. I had hired investigators, placed advertisements, even established a foundation dedicated to helping mechanics and auto workers, hoping word would reach your father. Harold knew about my search, knew how important it was to me to find the man who had saved my life, and he deliberately sabotaged every effort I made. Simone felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. He knew where Daddy was the whole time. The question came out as barely a whisper. Her voice choked with the magnitude of betrayal Edward was describing. She thought about her father's final years, working 2 jobs, to pay for cancer treatments, dying in a public hospital because he couldn't afford proper care, while the man who owed him a life debt searched frantically without success. Harold had connections throughout George's business community. Edward explained, his voice heavy with guilt. When my investigators got close to finding Dennis, Harold would make phone calls, pull strings, ensure that leads went nowhere, and records became mysteriously unavailable. He told me later that he considered it necessary intervention to keep me focused on business instead of wasting money on sentimental nonsense. The cruelty was breathtaking. Simone tried to imagine the callousness required to deliberately prevent someone from repaying a life debt, to condemn a dying man to poverty simply to preserve a business philosophy. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "What does Harold Manning have to do with what happened to me at Le Jardin?" Edward's expression grew grimmer. "After our partnership ended, Harold spent years trying to undermine everything I built. He couldn't touch my business directly, but he could influence the social circles where I moved, the restaurants, where I entertained clients, the charity events, where I tried to make connections. Olivia Hartwell isn't just his niece. She's his protégé, carefully placed where she can monitor my activities and make life difficult for anyone I try to help." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. "You think she knew?" Simone said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "When she fired me that night, when she made such a public spectacle, you think she knew you were watching, knew who I was?" The humiliation she had endured suddenly took on a different dimension, transforming from random cruelty into calculated malice designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "I'm certain of it," Edward replied grimly. "Harold has been having me watched for years, documenting my charitable activities and my foundation work, anyone I show interest in helping. When you started working at Le Jardin, when I began dining there regularly, Olivia would have reported back to him immediately. The timing of your firing, the public nature, the way she made sure I had a clear view, none of that was coincidental." Simone felt sick as she processed the implications. Her firing hadn't been the result of a difficult customer and an unsympathetic manager. It had been a deliberate attack, orchestrated by people who viewed kindness as weakness and saw her father's legacy of generosity as something to be crushed rather than honored. "What do they want?" she asked. Though she feared the answer would reveal depths of vindictiveness she wasn't prepared to confront. "Harold wants to prove that my charitable instincts are a liability," Edward explained. "Every person I try to help, every act of generosity I attempt, becomes a target for him to undermine. By destroying your livelihood, by ensuring you ended up desperate and struggling, he was trying to demonstrate that good deeds are pointless, that people like your father aren't worth the effort." The clinical nature of the cruelty was almost worse than random hatred. This was calculated destruction masquerading as business strategy. But Edward's next words transformed Simone's despair into something sharper. "There's something else you need to know. Le Jardin is hosting their 20th anniversary gala next month, a major charity event that Harold helped organize through his connections in Atlanta's social elite. Olivia is planning to use the event to showcase her management philosophy, to demonstrate how maintaining proper standards has contributed to the restaurant's success. She's going to celebrate firing me." The audacity was almost incomprehensible. Olivia Hartwell planned to turn her public humiliation into a success story, proof that discriminatory practices were not only acceptable, but beneficial to business operations. The thought of her former manager receiving accolades for the very behavior that had destroyed Simone's livelihood made her hands shake with suppressed fury. Edward leaned forward, his eyes intense with purpose. Not if we stop her first. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I believe we have an opportunity to turn Harold and Olivia's tactics against them. The gala will be attended by Atlanta's most influential business leaders, charity organizers, and social activists. If we can expose the truth about what really happened to you about the systematic discrimination that Olivia has been implementing under Harold's guidance, we can destroy their credibility in front of the very people they're trying to impress. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Simone imagined walking into that elegant ballroom filled with people who had watched her humiliation in silence, facing down the woman who had treated her with such contempt, and finally telling her side of the story to an audience that mattered. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "I want you to attend the gala as my guest," Edward said simply. "Not as a former waitress seeking revenge, but as the director of community outreach for the Pemberton Foundation, a position that would be entirely legitimate. You would have every right to be there, every reason to speak about the importance of treating service workers with dignity and respect. And when Olivia inevitably tries to defend her management practices, we'll be ready with documentation of her discriminatory behavior." Simone stared at him for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential for justice. The plan was ambitious, possibly dangerous, and would require her to face the most humiliating moment of her life in front of hundreds of strangers. But it would also give her the chance to honor her father's memory by standing up to the kind of cruelty and prejudice he had spent his life quietly fighting against. "When is this gala?" she asked finally, and Edward's smile told her he had been hoping for exactly that question. 3 weeks from Saturday. That gives us enough time to prepare properly to make sure you're ready for anything Olivia and Harold might try to throw at us." And he reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "I know I'm asking a lot from you, especially after everything you've been through, but I truly believe this is what your father would have wanted. Not revenge for its own sake, but justice that might prevent other people from suffering the way you've suffered." Simone looked down at her father's emerald ring, thinking about the man who had risked his life to save a stranger and refused payment for his kindness. Dennis Carter had believed in doing the right thing, regardless of personal cost, in standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. If there was a chance that confronting Olivia Hartwell could prevent other workers from experiencing the same discrimination and humiliation, then her father would have expected her to take that chance. "All right," she said quietly, looking up to meet Edward's grateful gaze. "Let's do this. Let's make them pay for what they've done." And 3 weeks later, Simone Carter stood before the mirror in her hotel room, barely recognizing herself. The elegant black evening gown Edward had purchased transformed her completely, its sophisticated cut making her look like she belonged among Atlanta's social elite. Her natural hair was styled in an updo, showcasing diamond earrings. Borrowed from Edward's collection, and professional makeup completed the transformation. But beneath the polished exterior, her heart pounded with terror and determination. Tonight was the Le Jardin 20th Anniversary Gala, and Simone would be walking back into the restaurant that had been the site of her greatest humiliation. But this time, she wasn't wearing a server's uniform or carrying plates to customers who barely acknowledged her existence. Tonight, she was Simone Carter, Director of Community Outreach for the Pemberton Foundation, and she had every right to be in that ballroom. More importantly, she had the power to expose the truth about Olivia Hartwell's systematic discrimination. Edward knocked softly on her door, and when she opened it, his expression shifted to something approaching awe. "You look absolutely stunning," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Your father would have been so proud to see you like this, not because of the dress or jewelry, but because of the strength and dignity you're carrying into battle tonight." He offered her his arm. "Are you ready to make some very powerful people extremely uncomfortable?" The ride to Le Jardin felt surreal familiar. Atlanta streets passing by the limousine windows, like scenes from someone else's life. Simone clutched her evening purse inside, which she carried copies of documentation Edward had gathered. Employment records showing patterns of discrimination. Witness statements from former employees, and recorded phone conversations between Harold Manning and Olivia Hartwell, discussing strategies for undermining Edward's charitable activities. When they arrived at the restaurant, Simone felt her breath catch. Le Jardin had been transformed with thousands of white roses adorning every surface and crystal chandeliers casting dancing light across the assembled crowd of Atlanta's most influential citizens. She recognized faces from newspaper society pages, local television personalities, prominent business leaders, and charity organizers. These were the people who shaped public opinion in Atlanta, who decided which causes deserved support and which individuals merited respect. Olivia stood near the main entrance greeting guests with a radiant smile that concealed years of calculated malice. She wore a stunning red gown that complemented her blonde hair perfectly, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. When she spotted Edward approaching with his mysterious female companion, her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered and approached them with outstretched hands. "Edward, how wonderful to see you tonight," Olivia said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I'm so pleased you could attend our little celebration. Le Jardin has always valued your patronage." Her eyes shifted to Simone, confusion flickering across her features before being replaced by polite curiosity. "And this lovely lady must be your guest for the evening. I don't believe we've been introduced." Edward's smile was equally false, but far more dangerous. "Olivia Hartwell, I'd like you to meet Simone Carter, the Director of Community Outreach for the Pemberton Foundation. Simone has been doing extraordinary work helping us identify organizations and individuals who demonstrate exceptional commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances." The emphasis he placed on those final words was subtle, but unmistakable. It took several seconds, but when understanding finally dawned, the color drained from Olivia's face so quickly that Simone worried she might actually faint. The restaurant manager's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she extended it towards Simone, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Ms. Carter, what a pleasant surprise. I had no idea you were involved with charitable work these days." "Oh, I've always been passionate about helping people," Simone replied with a serene smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Especially working people who face unfair treatment in their employment. There's something particularly satisfying about ensuring that good, hard-working individuals receive the respect and dignity they deserve. Don't you think?" She watched Olivia's expression grow increasingly panicked as the implications of her presence became clear. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness, each course of the elaborate dinner feeling like an eternity, as Simone sat at Edward's table, surrounded by Atlanta's social elite and waiting for her moment to speak. She made polite conversation with other guests, discussing the Pemberton Foundation's work and listening to their stories about various charitable causes. Many expressed genuine interest in her background and passion for workers' rights. But her attention remained focused on Olivia, who spent the entire evening moving through the crowd with increasingly frantic energy, her eyes constantly darting back to Simone's table. She had clearly recognized her former employee, but couldn't understand how the woman she had publicly humiliated and fired had transformed into a polished professional, sitting among the city's most influential citizens. Finally, the moment arrived. Olivia took the stage with a microphone, her voice projecting across the ballroom with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate 20 years of excellence at Le Jardin. When we opened our doors 2 decades ago, we made a commitment to maintaining the highest standards of service cuisine and hospitality. Tonight, I'm proud to say that we have never wavered from that commitment, even when it required making difficult decisions about staffing and personnel management. She paused for applause, her eyes scanning the crowd, until they found Simone's table. The restaurant industry faces constant pressure to lower standards, to compromise on quality, to accept mediocrity in the name of inclusivity. But at Le Jardin, we have always believed that excellence requires discrimination, the ability to distinguish between those who truly belong in an establishment of our caliber and those who simply do not meet our standards. Edward stood slowly, his movement drawing attention from across the ballroom. "Excuse me, Ms. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly without amplification. "I wonder if you might elaborate on what you mean by discrimination in staffing decisions. Are you referring to discrimination based on qualifications and experience? Or are you talking about other factors that might influence your personnel choices?" Olivia's smile became strained as she realized she was being maneuvered into dangerous territory. "Well, of course we consider qualifications first and foremost," she said carefully. "But maintaining the proper atmosphere at Le Jardin requires employees who understand and embody our values, who can interact appropriately with our distinguished clientele." "That's fascinating," Edward continued, moving closer to the stage, "because I'd like to introduce everyone to someone who embodies exactly the kind of values you're describing. Simone Carter. Would you please join me?" He gestured towards Simone, who rose from her seat with elegant grace and walked to the front of the ballroom, her heels clicking on the marble floor with each confident step. The murmur that rippled through the crowd suggested that many people recognized something significant was happening. Simone took the microphone from Edward's outstretched hand and looked directly at Olivia, whose face had gone completely white with terror and realization. "Good evening," Simone said, her voice steady and clear. "My name is Simone Carter, and 3 weeks ago, I was publicly humiliated and fired from this very restaurant by Ms. Hartwell for the crime of existing, while black, in a space she felt I didn't belong in." The ballroom fell into stunned silence. Simone continued, her voice growing stronger. "I worked at this restaurant for 3 years, serving customers with professionalism and dedication, despite facing daily microaggressions and discriminatory treatment. But apparently, my commitment to excellence wasn't enough to overcome Ms. Hartwell's belief that people who look like me don't belong in spaces like this." She turned to face the crowd, her emerald ring catching the light. "What you witnessed 3 weeks ago wasn't an isolated incident of poor management. It was part of a systematic campaign designed to hurt anyone that Mr. Pemberton tried to help through his charitable foundations. Hartwell's uncle Harold Manning orchestrated this cruelty to prove that kindness and compassion are weaknesses that successful people cannot afford." Olivia stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is completely inappropriate," she said, her voice shaking. "You have no right to disrupt our celebration with these baseless accusations." But her protests only served to confirm the truth of Simone's allegations in the minds of the watching crowd. Edward stepped up to the microphone. "Actually, Ms. Hartwell, these aren't baseless accusations. Over the past 3 weeks, the Pemberton Foundation has documented a pattern of discriminatory behavior at Le Jardin that violates both federal employment law and basic human decency." He produced a folder from his jacket. "We have witness statements, employment records, and recorded conversations that prove this discrimination was deliberate and systematic." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. These were Atlanta's social and business elite people who prided themselves on supporting progressive causes and inclusive policies. The idea that they had been dining at and supporting a restaurant that engaged in systematic racial discrimination was deeply troubling. Simone reclaimed the microphone for her final words. "I'm not here seeking pity or even personal revenge. I'm here because my father taught me that when you have the power to speak truth to injustice, you have a responsibility to do so. Tonight, you've learned something important about the character of the people who run this establishment. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." She handed the microphone back to Edward and walked toward the exit. Her head held high, despite the emotional toll of reliving her humiliation in front of hundreds of strangers. Behind her, she could hear the crowd erupting into animated conversations, voices raised in shock and outrage. By the next morning, the story had spread throughout Atlanta's social media networks and news outlets. Le Jardin's reservation book emptied as customers canceled bookings, and several major charity organizations announced they would no longer hold events at the restaurant. Olivia Hartwell was fired within 48 hours, her reputation permanently destroyed. The restaurant's owners issued a public apology and announced comprehensive policy changes. 2 months after the gala that changed everything, Simone Carter sat across from her mother and daughter at their kitchen table, watching Chloe carefully arrange her new school supplies for the upcoming semester. The 10-year-old had grown taller over the summer, her confidence blossoming along with her height, as she talked excitedly about starting 5th grade at the private academy that was now within their financial reach. The scholarship Edward had arranged through the Pemberton Foundation covered most of the tuition, but more importantly, it represented the kind of opportunities that had seemed impossible just a few months ago. "Mama, will you come to my presentation next week?" Chloe asked, looking up from her organized pencils and notebooks. "I'm doing my project on civil rights heroes, and I want to talk about Grandpa Dennis and how he helped people even when nobody was watching." The words came out matter-of-factly, but Simone felt her throat tighten with emotion at hearing her daughter speak about her grandfather with such pride and understanding. Simone's mother, Dorothy, reached across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand, with fingers that moved more easily now that they could afford the better arthritis medication. "Your grandfather would have been so proud to hear you say that, baby girl," she said, her voice warm with memory and love. "He always believed that the most important thing you could do in life was help somebody else, even if they never knew your name or thanked you for it." The changes in their lives since the gala had been profound and far-reaching. Le Jardin had closed permanently within 6 weeks of that eventful night, unable to recover from the exodus of customers and the cascade of discrimination lawsuits filed by former employees who had found the courage to speak out after Simone's public revelation. Olivia Hartwell had disappeared from Atlanta's social scene entirely, her reputation so thoroughly destroyed that she had reportedly moved to another state to start over under a different name. But the most significant change had been the establishment of the Dennis Carter Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting service workers from discrimination and providing legal support for those who faced unfair treatment in their workplaces. Edward had insisted that Simone serve as the foundation's president, a role that allowed her to transform her painful experience into meaningful action that could prevent other families from suffering the way hers had suffered. The foundation's offices occupied an entire floor of a downtown Atlanta building with a staff of 12 full-time employees, including lawyers, social workers, and community outreach specialists. They had already helped over 200 workers file complaints against employers, secured settlements totaling more than $3 million in back wages and damages, and partnered with local law schools to provide free legal clinics in underserved communities throughout Georgia. "The media requests are still coming in," Edward said, joining them at the kitchen table with a folder full of interview requests and speaking invitations. At 71, he moved with slightly less vigor than before, but his dedication to the foundation's work had given him a renewed sense of purpose that seemed to energize everything he did. "There's a national civil rights conference in Washington next month that wants you to be the keynote speaker, and PBS is interested in featuring the foundation in a documentary about workplace discrimination." Simone looked down at her father's emerald ring, which she had taken to wearing on a chain around her neck rather than on her finger. The jewelry felt too precious to risk losing during her busy days of meetings, court appearances, and community events. But she wanted to keep it close to her heart, where she could feel its weight as a constant reminder of the values that guided her work. "I still can't believe how much has changed," she said, shaking her head with wonder. 6 months ago, I was worried about paying rent and buying groceries. Now I'm running a foundation that employs more people than some small businesses. Sometimes I wake up thinking it's all been an elaborate dream." Edward smiled, but his expression carried the weight of complicated emotions. "I wish I could take credit for your success, but the truth is that you've accomplished all of this through your own strength and determination. I simply provided the resources and platform that you deserved all along. Your father gave me a second chance at life, and you gave me a second chance at redemption." The relationship between Simone and Edward had evolved into something resembling a familial bond, with him filling the role of mentor-supporter and surrogate father figure. Hipoa attended Chloe's school plays and soccer games, joined them for Sunday dinners, and had even insisted on walking Simone down the aisle when she eventually decided to marry again, though that was still hypothetical, as she remained focused on building the foundation and raising her daughter. "There's something I want to show you," Edward said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to a news article. "Harold Manning was arrested yesterday in Miami for tax evasion and fraud. Apparently, the investigation that started with our documentation of his interference in my search for your father uncovered a much larger pattern of illegal business practices. He's looking at significant prison time." Simone felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and cynicism at the news. She had never wanted revenge for its own sake, but seeing Manning face consequences for his years of systematic cruelty provided a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. "Do you think he understands what he lost by choosing greed over compassion?" she asked. "I doubt it," Edward replied honestly. "Men like Harold spend so much time convincing themselves that cruelty is strength that they become incapable of recognizing the power of kindness. But that's his tragedy, not ours. We've built something beautiful from the ashes of his attempts to destroy human decency." As if summoned by their conversation about legacy and values, Chloe looked up from her school supplies with the serious expression she wore when contemplating important questions. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to work at the foundation too. I want to help people the way you and Mr. Edward help people the way Grandpa Dennis helped people. Is that okay?" Simone felt tears prick at her eyes as she reached over to smooth her daughter's hair. "Baby, you can be anything you want to be when you grow up. But if you choose to spend your life helping others, then yes, that would make me prouder than I could ever express in words." She paused, thinking about the chain of kindness that had brought them to this moment. "Your grandfather always said that the most important thing you can leave behind isn't money or possessions, but the example you set for the people who come after you." Later that evening, after Chloe had gone to bed, and Edward had returned to his penthouse apartment, Simone and her mother sat on their small balcony overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The city lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars, and Simone found herself thinking about all the people working night shifts in restaurants, hotels, and office buildings, people who deserved dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances or the color of their skin. "Do you think Daddy knows what happened?" Simone asked, her voice soft in the warm night air. "Do you think he knows that his kindness to a stranger 20 years ago ended up changing so many lives?" Dorothy smiled, her weathered hands folded peacefully in her lap. "I believe your father is watching over us, and I believe he's proud of the woman you've become and the work you're doing. But more than that, I think he would tell you that this is exactly how kindness is supposed to work. Plant seeds that grow into trees whose fruit feeds people you may never meet." Simone touched the emerald ring hanging around her neck, feeling its familiar weight against her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new workers seeking help, new battles against discrimination and injustice. But tonight, sitting with her mother under the stars, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring a legacy of love and using personal pain to create positive change in the world. The Dennis Carter Foundation would continue to grow, touching lives across the Southeast and inspiring similar organizations in other regions. Simone would eventually write a book about her experience, donate the proceeds to worker advocacy groups, and see legislation passed in her father's name, protecting service employees from discrimination. But the most important legacy would be the countless acts of kindness inspired by her story. Servers treated with respect, workers defended against unfair treatment, and young people like Chloe, learning that their character mattered more than their circumstances. As she prepared for bed that night, Simone looked at herself in the same mirror where she had practiced her gala speech 2 months earlier. The woman staring back at her had the same face, the same dark eyes, the same natural hair pulled back in a simple style. But something fundamental had changed. A confidence born not from wealth or status, but from the knowledge that she had faced injustice and emerged victorious, not through revenge, but through the revolutionary act of transforming pain into purpose.